The passage upon which the teaching is based today comes from 1 Peter chapter 1 verses 3 to 9 and chapter 3 verses 14 to 16. All praise to God the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. It is by His great mercy that we have been born again, because God raised Jesus from the dead. And now we live with great expectation, and we have a priceless inheritance, an inheritance that is kept in heaven for you, pure and undefiled, beyond the reach of change and decay. And through your faith, God is protecting you by His power until you receive this salvation, which is ready to be revealed on the last day for all to see. So, be truly glad. There is wonderful joy ahead, even though you must endure many trials for a little while. These trials will show that your faith is genuine. It is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold, though your faith is far more precious than mere gold. So when your faith remains strong through many trials, it will bring you much praise and glory and honor on the day when Jesus Christ is revealed to the whole world. You love Him, even though you have never seen Him. Though you do not see Him now, you trust Him. And you receive with a glorious, inexpressible joy. You rejoice. The reward of trusting Him will be the salvation of your souls. But even if you suffer for doing what is right, God will reward you for it. So don't worry or be afraid of their threats. Instead, you must worship Christ as Lord of your life. And if someone asks you about the hope that you have as a believer, always be ready to explain it. But do this in a gentle and respectful way. Keep your conscience clear. Then if people speak against you, they will be ashamed when they see what a good life you live because you belong to Christ. This is God's Word. Today and next week, it is my plan and intention, God willing, to return to our annual theme here at Northside for 2023, Love Your Neighbor. Now, as I think about that theme, in light of the fact of recent events that have transpired in our community, it makes me realize the truth that when you and I feel endangered, when we feel wounded, or when we feel fearful, our natural tendency, I think, most all of us, is to want to withdraw from people around us. Or we may want to attack people around us. I wonder, how might we resist this tendency of when we're hurt or wounded or feel attacked, to allow our love for others to grow cold? You know, we can only love other people well around us whenever we are spiritually healthy. And a person's spiritual health, yours or mine, our spiritual health is almost exactly, if not exactly, proportional to the love you have for God. So what I'm saying is this: to love others well around us, we must first love God well. That's why Jesus would say these are the two greatest commands. Second on the list is to love your neighbor as yourself. But in order to do that, the first on the list is to love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And yet, just like when we feel hurt, wounded, or fearful, we have a tendency to want to withdraw from people, it is also true that when we feel hurt, wounded, or fearful, we have a tendency to want to withdraw from God. You see, loving God when life is painful is not always easy. So the question that I want to ponder with you for a few minutes is, how do we love God when we're hurting? How do we love God when we're hurting so much so that even in the very midst of our pain and woundedness, we can still be good witnesses for Jesus in view of our neighbors? So that's what I want us to look at today. How do we love God when we hurt so that we can still be good witnesses for Jesus among our neighbors? All right, so in order to answer or attempt to answer or address that question, first I think we need to deal with the very real challenge that all of us face when it comes to the problem of human suffering. Suffering is one of, if not the biggest problem that people that don't believe in Christianity have with Christianity. Here's what I mean. You're telling me I need to believe in God, huh? Well, if there is a God, then I would expect Him to be all-powerful, that there would be nothing beyond His ability to solve. So if God is all-powerful, and yet we or I am experiencing suffering in my life, then surely God could do something about it because He's all-powerful. But if He chooses not to do something about it, He must not be all-loving. You tell me to believe in God, huh? Well, maybe He is a good God. But if God is all good and I am suffering, then apparently He is incapable of doing anything about it. Therefore, He must not be all-powerful. Do you see the dilemma? The problem of human suffering for many people is a huge impediment for them believing in God. Because how could God be all-powerful, all-loving, and at the same time suffering exist, particularly suffering of innocence? You see, I think it is natural when we encounter the horrors of suffering in life to want to back off from belief in God or even abandon our belief in God when we experience times of suffering. But if you notice here in our text, the Apostle Peter, especially in verse number 6 of 1 Peter chapter 1, makes a statement that shows us that when you experience suffering, it doesn't have to weaken your faith. In fact, rather than weakening your faith, times of suffering can actually strengthen your faith. Listen to what he says again, beginning at verse 6. So then be truly glad. There is wonderful joy ahead, even though you must endure many trials for a little while. These trials will show that your faith is genuine. It is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold, although your faith is more precious than mere gold. So you see, in the face of suffering, you say, well, I used to believe in God, but then this happened. And how could God let this, whatever this is, happen. And so because this has happened, I'm not so sure I can believe in God anymore. But I want to tell you, if those are thoughts that you're having, or thoughts that you have had in the past, abandoning your faith in the face of suffering, abandoning your faith in God when you're hurting, actually doesn't help anything. It doesn't help the situation because you're still suffering. And how would abandoning God actually give you more understanding as to why you're suffering? Or how would abandoning God in the midst of your suffering actually help you handle the suffering? You see, in reality, abandoning God in the midst of your pain doesn't really help anything. In fact, if you say in the midst of suffering that there is no God, how can you say that whatever this is that you're wrestling with, how can you say that it is an unjust, unfair thing that ought not happen? Here's what I mean. Let's say that something is happening in your life and you say, this ought not be so. There's something deep inside of you that says, this is not the way it ought to be. It's unjust. What is your basis for saying that that thing ought not to be? What is your basis for saying that that thing is unjust? Follow me now. Because if there is no God, as secularists would say, then the explanation for everything in life is only natural explanations. And therefore, whenever you say this thing ought not to happen, if all that there is the natural observable things of natural law, then there is nothing more natural than violence. There's nothing more natural than violence. Because if it's all just natural, as evolutionary theory would say, as Darwin would say, then the most natural thing in the world is survival of the fittest. And so if innocent people are slaughtered, well, then that's just natural. The weak, the frail. Why do you feel like that ought not happen? Why does that pain your conscience? Why does that bother you? You see, what I'm saying is your instinct to recoil against evil, your instinct to have a sense of this ought not to be when you see violence in our world is actually proof that God is real. Your instinct against it is proof that there is something beyond the natural. Otherwise, you have no basis to object against violence. If there is no God, it's just simply your feeling. I like the way Tim Keller puts it. He says, if you don't believe in God, suffering and evil is as big a problem, if not a bigger problem, than if you do believe in God. Because you see, evil and suffering is a problem, yes, for those who believe in God, but evil and suffering is a bigger problem for those who don't believe in God. Getting rid of your belief in God in the face of your suffering in order to help you handle it or understand your suffering actually will be of no help at all to you. So the question is, what will help? If this is the challenge that we face, the challenge of suffering, what will help us to be able to acknowledge God and love God more deeply even in the midst of the trials? You see, that's what Peter said. Peter said you can rejoice even when the trials come because the trials will actually strengthen your faith if you allow them to. They will actually cause your faith to have more endurance in the midst of it. It will refine your faith. You see, Peter compares suffering to a refining fire that you put metals through. That's verse 7. So you take metal within the dross of what is mined out of the earth, you put it in the refining fire, and all of the dross and impurities through the licking flames and the burning heat of the refining fire burns away all of the things that you don't want there, to leave behind the purity and beauty of the pure gold itself is only what is left. Now, when Peter says that it is the refining fires that can actually strengthen our faith, he most likely, at least it seems like, he is referring to Daniel chapter 3. You see, in the Old Testament book of Daniel, there were 3 Jewish boys who refused to bow down before a pagan representation of a god in the form of a political leader, Nebuchadnezzar. They refused to bow down. We will not serve your God. Even if he doesn't deliver us, we refuse to serve him because your God is a false god and we know who the true God is. Well, if you don't bow down, Nebuchadnezzar said, I will throw you into my fiery furnace. And so he prepared the furnace to be heated 7 times more hot than normal, to the point that even it killed the soldiers that opened the doors to the furnace to throw the 3 boys in. And yet the 3 boys are thrown in the fire, and King Nebuchadnezzar says in Daniel 3, I looked into the furnace where we had thrown 3 boys, but I saw 4 walking around, and the 4th of them looked to me as if to be like the Son of God. This is a pagan king who says, I saw a 4th person walking in the fire with them. And in the midst of all of the licking flames of the fiery furnace, those 3 boys emerged without even a hair on their head singed, without even the smell of smoke on their clothing. God delivered them from that fiery furnace. It also reminds me of Isaiah 43. The prophet Isaiah, in Isaiah 43, verses 1 through 3, makes a promise, being the mouthpiece of God, who says to God's people, when you walk through the fire of opposition, you will not be burned up. The flames will not consume you. Now, keep in mind what Isaiah is promising here. Don't misunderstand him. The promise is not that if you believe, then you won't go through the deep waters. You won't go through the fiery trials. That's not the promise. Neither is the promise, well, if you go through the trials, there's no if. Rather, the promise is when you do, and you will, go through the times of suffering and trial, when you are in the furnace, God says, I will be with you in the flames. I will be with you right there in the fire. I will be with you to the point that, yes, the flames will be all around you, but the flames will not consume you. They will not break you. The times of suffering will not break you down, but I will be there with you in the flame. And when you recognize I'm there with you in the midst of the trial, I will refine you. And I'll make you stronger than when you went in. Now, how can we know that's true, though? All of us would love to believe that that's the case. But how, God, can I know that's true? It's only when you get to the cross that you can know how far God was willing to go himself to make good on that promise. You see, only Christianity, of all the world religions, only Christianity says that God loved you enough to become vulnerable. That of all the religions of the world, only Christianity says that God himself would become touchable by human suffering. Look to the cross. Walk up that hill called Calvary. Stand at the foot of the cross and look at the man hanging there and see what you see. What you see there. When you come to the foot of the cross, you may come there being someone who has suffered horrible injustice. And that's been your suffering. You may come to the cross having known the power of injustice. And you look at that cross and what you see is a man who was hung there unjustly for a crime he didn't commit. He understands the suffering of injustice. Or maybe you come to the cross having lost a loved one, someone you loved so dearly. And you can't even think how you would go on in the midst of no longer having them with you. Come to the foot of the cross and look at Jesus and see if you don't see a father losing his son. You may be coming to the cross screaming out in pain because of what you've gone through, thinking, God, how long will you let this go on? How long will you let that continue to happen in my family? How long will you continue to let me undergo the torment of this pain and agony? How long will you let this injustice happen within our culture and all of this horrible darkness that is influencing so many people for the evil one? How long, O Lord, how long? And you come to the cross and you see the man hanging there who screams, why, God? Why have you forsaken me? You see, Jesus, when he suffered on the cross, experienced human pain just like us in every imaginable way. And as hard and as difficult as your suffering may be, please know that Jesus' suffering was infinitely greater than all of our suffering combined. Because what Jesus is suffering on the cross is the unimaginable. What the Bible would teach us is that Jesus on the cross is bearing the guilt and sin of the whole world. Imagine what the injustice is of an innocent Son of God having placed upon him all of the unspeakable evil and horrible acts of all of humanity from the beginning to the end of history, being placed upon him there. Imagine the penalty of an eternity in hell that the sins of just one person deserves. Imagine the weight of that multiplied over with every human that has ever lived being placed upon him there. What Jesus is experiencing on the cross is cosmic suffering. He lost the source of all light and life, whether we realize it or not. When you're going through your darkest moment, the dark night of the soul, where you think things could not get any worse, even in your darkest place, there is still a glimmer of God's love and light that is on you. It's still there. God is still causing the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. But when Jesus was on the cross, all of that love and light was totally shut off from him. He was cast out of the presence of God with infinite suffering, vastly more terrible than Nebuchadnezzar's furnace. Jesus stood at the mouth of an eternal flame, seeing the raging flames and the glowing heat, knowing what he was about to suffer, but he was willing to suffer it for you and for me. So when you look at the cross and you say, Lord, why would you let suffering happen for people who love you? Look to Jesus and what you will see when you go to the cross is that the cross, it doesn't tell us the answer as to why God allows suffering. But what it does tell us is what the answer can't be. Why does God allow human suffering, and in particular, Christians to suffer? It can't be because He doesn't love us. It can't be because He is remote and doesn't care. It can't be because He doesn't have the power to move in, because the presence of Jesus is the demonstration of Him moving in, is the demonstration of Him knowing our pain and choosing and wanting to do something about it. It's not because He's not there, because Jesus is God Himself in human form, plunging Himself into our suffering on an infinite scale. You see, He loves you and me, and He hates suffering that much. Jesus went into the ultimate furnace for you. And because He went into the infinite furnace for you, that is the assurance that you have that He is with you in your personal furnace. Well, I'll tell you, suffering grabs our attention like nothing else, doesn't it? When you and I go through times of hardship, it has a way of grabbing us by the throat and waking us up out of our apathy and giving us a laser focus upon what we're experiencing in life at that moment. Not only does suffering grab our attention personally, but when we see others suffering, it grabs our attention too. John Newton, who is the songwriter who wrote probably the most beloved Christian hymn ever written, Amazing Grace. John Newton compared faithful Christians who suffer to the burning bush. He said, Christians who endure tremendous suffering are a spectacle of grace to the church. They are like burning bushes unconsumed. Newton said, when you see a Christian that is suffering and yet they maintain their faith and their trust in God in the midst of the flame, knowing that God is in the fire with them, they are like Moses on the mountain seeing a bush that is aflame, and Moses asked the question, and people who see us suffering when we're going through our flames and yet we maintain faith in God, they ask the same question too. Why is this bush not burned up? And the only explanation is the miracle of God's sustaining grace. So Peter says that when you're suffering and you're going through immense trial, and yet in the midst of all of that, you continue to live right. You don't compromise, you don't give in. You don't escape to immoral behavior, but in the midst of your suffering, you continue to live right. In the midst of your suffering, you continue to maintain your hope. In the midst of the flames, if you do that, and people see you doing that, it demands an explanation. People will ask, how in the world are you getting through this like you're getting through it? How in the world are you maintaining your trust in God? How are you maintaining your hope in the midst of such unspeakable darkness? People will ask you about your hope as a believer. And Peter says in chapter 3 and verse 15, be ready in that moment to give an answer for the hope that lies within you. Because you see, in that moment, there is no greater opportunity to witness to our unbelieving neighbors than when a Christian has a hope-filled expectation of faith and trust in God in the midst of the flames. So, church, to love our neighbors well, we have to be people of compassion. Compassion means that we're in touch with our own suffering, with our own woundedness. And then we're prepared to be able to show empathy toward others in their suffering and woundedness. But in order to have compassion, we have to be honest, church, about our own wounds and how God has had love for us even in the midst of those refining fires. And then we're in a much better place to provide an authentic witness of the living hope that you can have in Jesus Christ, even in the midst of the fire.